Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Midlife Revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor. And tonight I am joined once again by Jonathan. Jonathan, thanks for being here with us tonight.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me again. I just did a revamp and I changed everything so it's all under the Awakening expansion. So now
Okay,
TikTok, YouTube, and um, Instagram is Awakening expansion.
awesome. So I thought that tonight, this is our fourth time talking together. And our other episodes that we did were kind of deep dives. I think it's a helpful conversation to have. What are some of the red flags that come up when you're dating a narcissist or when you're in a relationship with a narcissist? And what should you do when you notice some of these red flags? So I have a little bit of a list, but I'm curious from your perspective. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time who don't know Jonathan, Jonathan is a former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as am I. Jonathan went through an entire deconstruction journey with addiction, relationship issues, and became aware that he was using narcissistic traits in his relationship and is now a certified healer and is trying to help other, especially men, realize the manipulative tactics that they might be employing in their relationships. And what else do you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's really just going back to what I want my channel and everything to be is really just understanding your conditioning, understanding your programming, and understanding that kind of voice inside your head isn't really you. And the true you deep down in there is just pure light, pure joy, and has infinite capacity for love, joy, curiosity, and we get so bogged down with everything that we saw growing up, everything that we were taught growing up, and that really programmed us into something that might not be in alignment with what we want, and that can cause a lot of depression, that can cause a lot of just really difficult times. Whereas you're able to explore that, see where they're coming from, and really heal through those uncomfortable times and those uncomfortable parts that you don't necessarily understand, and beginning to see where they're coming from, understanding they're there to protect you. They may have learned maladaptive measures to do so, but once you can kind of begin that journey with self-awareness, you can see where a lot of things of these things came from, and you can have a lot more compassion for yourself, and then realize tapping right back into that little child, and really having so much more room for self-expansion, capacity for love, for affection for others, for just outright unconditional love that maybe you didn't really even understand how to do. And that's kind of what I went through. What I was raised with taught me a lot of things, and as we've discussed in the LDS church specifically, it does foster and cater to a lot of narcissistic tendencies that can develop. And I'm just simply trying to show people that that's not how it has to be, and that there truly is a way to heal, learn from those parts, and expand into truly the highest self, and the version of you that you've always wanted. It's all within you, and it's achievable.
That's awesome. I love that. Okay, so I'm thinking back to when I first got divorced and I was out there in the dating scene, which I absolutely hated. I did not enjoy it at all. But I think it was constantly like a sifting process of like going through, looking at profiles and then messaging with somebody. And then you finally find someone you do want to meet in person. And then it's like the first date. And then it's like, well, is there going to be a second date kind of thing? So I don't know about you out in the dating world, but for me, I was constantly looking for red flags. I was looking for it in our messaging before we even met up in person. Then I was looking for it in person, looking for body language, other things like that. So, just given the fact that there are so many different personality styles out there, and there are plenty of people out there who have maybe some narcissistic traits, but who aren't necessarily a full-blown narcissist. So we don't want to kind of just put up a wall and say, oh, I'm never going to talk to anybody ever again. But we want to be informed about what some red flags might be. And then if we're currently in a relationship, it might be helpful for us to take some of these ideas and think about our interactions with our current partner and see how healthy our relationship is. So I don't know if you have a jumping off point that you want to go from, or what's the best way to dive in?
Yeah, well, we can start there for sure. And like you said, not everyone is a full-blown narcissist, but we all have narcissistic tendencies. Like, let's
Right.
all just understand that and give ourselves some grace through society, through everything we live in, and how this world works. We all do, and that's okay. It just becomes how much of it is there self-awareness? Is there accountability? Is there a desire to understand these things? And so you
Yeah.
mentioned right out dating. We can kind of start there. I would be on the prowl for, because obviously during the beginning of dating, we call, getting to know each other, honeymoon phase. You're on your best behavior. um, you're not really showing who you are fully, and that's okay. Like, let's all understand that that's kind of a part of dating. I wish it wasn't. But one thing to look for is what becomes toxic, I think, is a person is looking for something specific, and you're kind of asking each other questions, and you're loving that you're agreeing on something, and then subconsciously, like from a person who's had deep narcissistic tendencies, um, that I didn't realize, but you're looking for them to fit this box, right? You're looking for them to fit into what I want. And in those beginning stages, a lot of times we cater to the other person because we're trying to say what we think they want. And
Sure.
we're not getting into the realm of toxicity yet, because you're trying to, you're trying to accommodate, you're trying to find common ground, and that's all okay. But I think, so the first advice I would give is don't do that too much. Be who you are, first of all. And if there is a disagreement and you guys completely are not on the same page with something, that's okay. That's the beauty of growing and learning a new perspective. And so I think too often we see that as, oh, I've got to change this person, or I've got to run. And that's understandable. But let's first just start off like, you're actually trying to get to know the person. You're really trying to get to know them, and you're not trying to meet the secretary, the receptionist. You're trying to get to meet them, and you don't want to necessarily only see them on their best behavior. You don't want to agree on everything. And I think we can get caught up into that, because it's like, oh yes, we agree on this politic, we agree on this is great, this is great, and that is great. But I think sometimes we can get caught up in that, and before we know it, we ourselves have put on a mask to accommodate the other person, and they may have done that too, and further down the line, that's going to lead to some very difficult situations. So
Yeah.
maybe starting there, in the
Yeah.
early dating scene, right?
Yeah. And I agree with you that it is wise to be somewhat guarded, to not, you know, give away all your secrets on the first date,
Right.
to reserve some things, and to not necessarily, come out and be 100% vulnerable, to overshare, to trauma dump, any of that kind of stuff when you're first meeting somebody. For me personally, I think what I keep coming back to all the time is that all relationships are about, well, all healthy relationships are about good communication. So for me, the first things that I notice are whether or not somebody is engaging in a conversation. Is this conversation two-way street, or is it one-sided? Is this them telling me all about themselves and never asking me a question, me trying to share something, and then them steering it right back to their own description of themselves, or whatever it is that they want to tell me. So for me, that to me is the first thing that I notice, is whether or not the conversation is a two-way street.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. Because if it's truly a narcissist or someone who has deep tendencies, let's say, they're viewing this as an opportunity for a show. They are thinking of it in terms of how did I perform? Did she like me? Is she thinking about me now? How was my performance? Right? And so that's not how it should be, right? It really should be an opportunity for you two to get to know each other. And it doesn't have to be like how you performed. And I caught myself doing that, of trying to just perform really, really well. And so if you're trying to, piece through some potential red flags, is exactly what you said, is did they engage me? Were they genuinely interested in what I had to say? Was there some follow-up questions? Or, hey, tell me more about that. That is fascinating, instead of redirecting the conversation so that I can now present my genius or how great I am. That's a clear red flag that I would be concerned with. As charming, as impressive, as whatever it may be, keep that tab. And I think I always, since I've learned that similar thing is, do they ask me things? Are they interested in who I am? Do they really want to understand me and truly get to know me, or is this a performance?
Yeah, that's a really good point, the performance aspect of it. Also, I think I can tell when somebody is listening to understand me versus listening to have a response to something. I
Of
can sort of
course.
see them like holding that thought in their head. Okay, when she's done, then I'm going to say my thing. So just those first communication pieces to me, that's a big deal. And it's again, I'm going to preface all of this that we're talking about by saying, again, that just because you encounter a red flag or even two, it doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, we're done. We're going to end the relationship right here. We can just sort of make note of the things that we're noticing and sort of put that in the database, just to inform conversations going forward.
Yes, yeah. A telltale is are they truly interested? And like you said, you can kind of start to see, if you're maybe finishing up your thought, or you can see them react in a way to they now know what they're gonna say. And honestly, you can kind of check that, by maybe asking a follow-up question, but really just look at this as, is this person interested in getting to know who I am? And like you said before, in the beginning, you don't want to trauma dump, right? We don't want to go there. And especially with a narcissist, where there's this deep attraction or whatever, there is a desire to be vulnerable and reveal things because you feel this special feeling. Well, I hate to break it to you, that special feeling isn't necessarily the sign of a secure relationship. That can be anxiety. That can be, their emotional inavailability. So just be cognizant of that special butterfly feeling, because it's not necessarily a good thing. It's something to notice and be cognizant of, because that's not necessarily the universe or God saying this is the one. This is your body is literally having an emotional response to something.
Yeah, and a lot of times when it's a new relationship, that emotional response is just, this is new, it's exciting, it's fun to be out, it's fun to be meeting somebody new. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're the one or that there's some kind of lightning bolt moment that's happening. So again, just being observant in those early days and taking in the information, but not necessarily taking action on it yet. Just learning all
Yeah.
that we can at the beginning
Yes.
stages.
And someone with narcissistic tendencies, will push the relationship and go very, very quickly. Things will escalate very, very quickly. And so please beware of that. Be on your guard. There is never any reason to rush anything ever, ever. Um, Regardless of what they say. So just be aware of that. If you sense that they are starting to want to maybe get into the trauma quickly, just be aware of that. And as we've said before, boundaries are really important. And if this is a great person and they truly were just maybe a little excited, they're going to respect that boundary.
Yeah, the other thing is, we hear a lot about the love bombing phase in a narcissistic relationship cycle. And for whatever reason, that has never really resonated with me as something that I could easily pick out as a red flag, because I think all new relationships go through a phase where it's new, it's exciting. You're maybe texting each other a lot, you're calling each other a lot. There's a desire to spend a lot of time together, as much time together as possible. I don't necessarily see that as a red flag. I think all relationships go through that particular phase. For me, where love bombing becomes a red flag is when it follows a cycle of, like, we had a fight, we had an argument, we disagreed about something, it was pretty bad. And then all of a sudden, just a short time later, we're back with love bombing again. That excessive apologizing or buying big expensive gifts or the big fancy dinners or things like that. I don't know how much of that you experienced or participated in, but if you want to comment on that or not.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, love bombing is tricky because obviously in the beginning you're excited and you're wanting to impress, and you're excited about the potential, and you see someone that you like being around, and so your behavior is going to show that. So the love, doing a lot deeper dive right into understanding narcissistic tendencies and so forth. Because in my situation, she did want to take it slower, and I did push for that. And looking back, I didn't necessarily even understand why I wanted to do that. But if you take a really deep dive into that, the reason is that wearing that mask, we'll just assume, during the love bombing, which is I want to get supply from you, and I want to be able to remove my mask as quickly as possible, right? Because it's exhausting. So, a reason that true narcissistic disorder people do that is they're trying to get you quick so that they can get you and remove the mask. And they don't have to really try anymore, if that makes sense. So, that's where the love bombing becomes toxic. But a perfectly normal person in the beginning can totally express love and show admiration and really try to impress and have a good time. Those are fun, precious memories that you can create. Now, yes, when conflict does arrive, and perhaps a mask comes off and there is a fight or something, what you want to be cognizant of and look out for is you really want true conflict resolution. You do not want just the love bombing or the emotionality or vulnerability to just get back to baseline, right? Because getting back to baseline over a long period of time is dissatisfying for the other person. They're unhappy. Well, getting back to baseline for a narcissist is happy, is comfort, is what they're trying to get back to, versus we're going to have a really understanding, loving conflict resolution situation where you feel heard, I feel heard, I understand what the misstep was, what the miscommunication was, and now there's going to be a commitment to change and moving forward. It shouldn't just be let's get back to the lovey-dovey stage of now we're back in our comfort zone.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that I look out for, is how do people handle conflict and how do they take criticism? Are they able to receive criticism without shame? Are they able to give criticism without judgment? And then when a conflict arises, how do they handle that? Are they able to regulate their emotions, manage their anger? And then, as you say, I think probably the most important piece of that is the repair after conflict. Are they able to make that relational repair? Are they able to take it back into, okay, can we come to an understanding? Here's a resolution type of situation. Or Are they going to punish you with things like the silent treatment, the cold shoulder? Are they going to try to get you to suffer because you've had this conflict? So that's another thing that I think is really important that I look out for.
Yes. If they are overly defensive, um, that is not a good sign. If they immediately feel attacked at any request or bid that you put out, that's just not a good sign. And maybe, thinking back of how what could have helped me better in that situation um, is if you do see that, um, in a calm manner, just be like, I feel like you're getting very defensive about what I am saying. Um, can you walk me through that? Like, what are you feeling, and what are the thoughts that you're experiencing right now as I'm saying this and asking for this? What about that makes you defensive? And and I think it's always good if they're willing to open up, and maybe they even catch themselves, because most people with narcissistic tendencies don't think they're a narcissist, and they don't think that getting defensive is necessarily narcissistic, and it doesn't have to be. It's not. It's a pattern, and it's a willingness to, as we always say, take accountability. And one way to not take accountability is to deflect and turn it around and get very defensive.
So that taking accountability piece, it can show up in small ways, especially early on in a dating relationship. It looks like blaming everything on the waiter instead of taking responsibility for your own, actions during the dinner or whatever. So we can always have in our minds sort of those narcissistic traits to be on the lookout for, and the ways that they show up in, a dating relationship or an early on relationship. So I think about that inability to take responsibility. That I think is probably the biggest piece for me. That's the biggest red flag that I watch out for. Are they able to apologize? Are they able to say, "Oh, I should have handled that differently," and then that need for constant praise or approval can look like fishing for compliments or constantly talking about their accomplishments or their achievements or whatever. What are some of the other things that stand out to you in that area?
Yeah, so getting back to the accountability, eh, a lot of excuses were presented. Um, Very rarely was it ever just like, you know what, you are right. I completely forgot, or I did not put enough effort into that. I should have absolutely did that. There was always a reason why that commitment or whatever it wasn't able to be fulfilled as requested and agreed upon, right? There was always an excuse to downgrade it. um, and I would be very careful of looking at that. Excuses happen, right? But if you start to see a pattern of that, I think that's really, really crucial, and it's a way that someone, that I went through is able to literally in my own head justify it.
That can be really tough to grapple with when you confront someone with a problematic behavior. How do they respond? You know, that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and I think, in that honeymoon phase or the love bombing, that is why that kind of happens, is they're avoiding that at all costs, because they don't want, um, sometimes they don't even trust themselves, or they fear themselves of what they'll say if there is a disagreement or something. So I think that is why it can be prolonged so long, and maybe pushing into the, moving in with each other or pushing into a serious committed relationship happens sooner, so that when those things do arise, you assume that you guys are in too deep and she won't or he won't leave.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess that kind of brings me to my other, the last point that I sort of wanted to touch on is when you enact or enforce a personal boundary, how does the other person react? So for example, you're saying the person is going to push to move in together really soon. to me, looking at, okay, what does it look like if I give some pushback about that? If I say, hey, I'm not quite ready for that yet, how do they respond to that? Do they get super angry and start trying to say that, guilt trip you, say that you must not really care about me, those kinds of excuses? Or do they say, hey, that's totally understandable, I get it? Are they coming at it from a place of understanding and like wanting to get to know you and why you feel this way? Or are they just defensive and wanting to control the situation?
Yeah, absolutely spot on, Megan, again. And I kind of want to bring up maybe a little less obvious one, because I didn't realize this was going on at the time. But it's not going to be as obvious as they immediately get ticked off and start yelling at you at the first time you challenge or set a boundary. No, it doesn't have to be that obvious. Um, it can be true, heartfelt, um, you know, traits that they don't even realize they have, that these things are ingrained, and if they haven't done the work, they don't even know they're there. So it can be really tricky. And so I'm just going to be honest and kind of point out some things that in those situations you have to be really careful of. Um, in my mind, or in the mind of someone with narcissistic tendencies, they really believe A, what they feel, and B, what they say. They really believe that. So if there's a boundary, and maybe in a skewed way, I view that as you're trying to distance yourself from me, and you're really not wanting to get as close to me as I want to get to you, then, in my brain, that's a red flag for me, because I'm like, I love and care about you more than you love and care about me, and you actually believe that. And that's not good. So I'm just trying to maybe call out some things that it's not always just going to be that he yells at you and causes violence when you bring up a boundary. No, like, he really, or she, or whoever, believes that they're in love, and they're on a one track mind to be with you the rest of your life and get you and live happily ever after. Like, those were feelings that I had, and I was concerned that maybe she didn't love me as much as I loved her. And so that was that was brought up, and it makes me cringe a little bit now talking about it. But it's not always going to be like, oh, you're setting a boundary, how dare you. It's like hurt, like, oh my gosh, this is threatening my self-esteem. I need your validation, and I'm interpreting that as you don't want this as much as me, and that's devastating. So just, I guess, watch out for that, because it's not always as obvious as you think.
So many of us have abandonment wounds and we don't realize it. And we don't realize that that's what's happening when someone puts up a boundary, or they take a step back, or even they say, slow down, not ready for that yet. A lot of that feels like abandonment to those of us who have that wound. And so when the relationship isn't going the way that you think it ought to, or the way that you want it to, it's really easy to get offended and upset.
Yes.
And blame it on the other person, rather than saying, okay, I'm upset right now. It's not your fault, for wanting the relationship to progress and I don't, or vice versa, right? What we have to take a look at is, I'm having some emotions come up that feel scary to me. I don't like them. It's not your fault. This is something that is coming from my side of the street. So I need to be the one to unpack that. I need to meditate. I need to journal. I need to figure out why I'm feeling this way. Because 9 times out of 10, in a healthy relationship, it's going to be something that either you or your partner bring to the relationship from some past encounter or some past trauma that's happened. So while it is important to be aware of red flags, it's also important to think about the idea that none of us come to a relationship perfectly whole, healed, and healthy. We all we all have our issues that we're going to bring to the table. And I think that especially at this age, and you're younger than I am, but for me, when you're talking about a second primary relationship, or you're talking about after a divorce or after a long-term relationship has ended, you're always going to bring some of that wounding to the new relationship unless you take your time to work through it and figure it out. So all of that just to say, we're talking about all these red flags, but it's also really important to recognize when a person is just trying to do their best. And for me, that looks like the ability to say, hey, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but here's how I'm feeling. And I'd really like to figure this out with you, as opposed to all of the red flag things like gaslighting, the silent treatment, passive aggressive actions. Those are the things that, if you can come through a conflict and repair it, great. If you're enacting some of these other passive aggressive actions, gaslighting and stuff like that, then that's probably not a relationship that's able to progress, because you can't work through the conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone is going to bring, I hate the word, but baggage, trauma. I mean, in a perfect world, we would all have gone through and healed our trauma, and we can just jump right into a secure relationship. But that's just not the reality. And we all have different attachment styles. We have abandonment wounds. We all have different histories. We all have things that we went through and that we suffered from. And narcissism, people who have narcissistic tendencies or even the flat out disorder, they went through some stuff. And if it's unresolved, it's going to be really, really difficult, unfortunately. So these, I think, are good ways to, kind of test and see how they respond. But I did not know I had these things that I needed to resolve. I was clean and sober. I had a lot of breakthroughs in rehab, and I had done a lot of internal work on myself. But then getting into a relationship, it's a big mirror, and a lot of things can pop up that if they're
Yeah.
unresolved, they will show themselves for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I guess just to kind of, wrap up, and I don't know if you have additional things that you wanted to talk about, but I think it's easy to look at the narcissistic traits and say, like, okay, if somebody's gaslighting me, obviously that's a red flag. If somebody is grandiose, obviously that's a red flag. If somebody is, making it all about them, or if they're constantly needing validation, like those, obviously we know those things are red flags. I wanted to just talk about things that come up in a little more of a subtle way. The other point that I want to be sure to make is that no relationship is going to be without conflict. And so for me, the most important thing is, how do you resolve conflict? How do you handle conflict? How do you repair afterwards? And do you have an ability to go through a conflict together and communicate in healthy ways about it? And I guess my two big, huge things are that I deserve to be treated with kindness and respect, even when we're in the middle of conflict. So if we're having a disagreement, if we're having a debate, if there's something we fundamentally just don't see eye to eye on, it's still possible for us to have a relationship. But in those disagreements, in those debates, am I being treated with kindness and respect? Am I being heard and understood? Do I feel validated by the person across the table from me in a way that makes me feel empowered to continue developing myself? Or do I feel like I'm having to avoid topics? Do I feel like I'm having to change the subject? Do I feel like I'm having to hide parts of myself or change parts of myself in order to fit into this relationship? So those are some of the things that I look for.
Yeah, and that's really smart. If you're not able to be your full authentic self, then what are we doing? And I mean that with the most compassion ever, because I've been there. I created a situation where my partner couldn't be her full authentic self, and not avoiding conflict or avoiding certain things or walking on eggshells or changing parts of her to accommodate me. And that's not a great feeling, you know. But conflict resolution and being respectful and kind to each other during that, like if you can go into it understanding, like if they're willing to work on this, I'm willing to work with them, right? And I think that's so crucial. And instead of um, you know, I've said this before. I really avoided shame. Like I never wanted to admit or feel like I was the problem. And that goes back to a lot of my own self-esteem and being able to self-validate and self-love. So things to look out for, maybe, and I hate to say this, but I think you really need to, is understand what their parent dynamic was like. How did their parents treat each other? Because I promise you, as much as I never wanted to become like what I saw as negative parts of my parents or my dad, even when I thought I was doing absolutely everything I possibly could not to be like that, it's kind of imprinted. You know, it's almost through osmosis that happens. And you know, how did he treat his wife? Was there respect? What was their conflict resolution like? And I wish, you know, we had had these discussions um, with my previous partner and understanding like we avoided conflict like the plague. You know, my dad wouldn't bring up an issue. He would just silent treatment or rage. And I always, you know, I'm thinking in my head, yeah, what a jerk. How could you possibly do that? That can come up and you don't even want it to, you know,
Yeah.
and you don't even want it to.
Yeah,
And there,
I think it's so easy to fall into what was modeled for us, you know, so we have to give ourselves a lot of compassion and grace for the fact that if we didn't have a healthy model as a child of adults resolving conflict in healthy ways, we're obviously not going to know how to do it. So we have to teach ourselves how to do it. We have to learn by trial and error. And you know, I think one of the things you said is really important to consider. Like, if this person wants to work on it, I will work on it with them. However, I'll put a little caveat in there as well. One of the things Dr. Ramani says, and she's the narcissist expert,
Mhm.
she says anyone can change, the narcissist won't. They don't think there's anything wrong with their behavior. So if you're working on something with your partner and you recognize the same patterns of behavior and the same cycles are coming up over and over again, there's your red flag right there. Because yeah, I agree with you. Like if somebody else wants to work on the relationship, I want to work on it too. It's a, you know, it's a joint effort here. But if it gets to the point where they're breadcrumbing you, in other words, like just making just enough change to keep you hanging on, but then they go back to their same old patterns of relating again, those are red flags. So there is a point at which you have to assess the relationship in the situation and say, okay, have we been here before? Is this something that we've already worked on and we thought was going to change and now it's come up again? Or is this a new issue? We just always have to be always have to be evaluating, is this a cycle that's unhealthy that we're repeating? Or are we really working together for a solution?
Exactly. And a more subtle thing that I think needs to be considered, there can be accountability or like remorse or I'm so sorry. Um, and acknowledging that. And I hope that that doesn't immediately think in your head, okay, I can excuse them now because they're taking accountability and they've said they're sorry. Well, there has to be action, right? And I fell into this and I wanted to change and and I truly was sorry, but there was for whatever reason there was maybe a little breadcrumbing, right? Because if you truly care and you have the space and you've healed your blocks and everything, then you will change for that person. You just will. And if they're not and they say all the right things even in those difficult conversations, and maybe even they get emotional and they come up with excuses and they convince you that oh, maybe I was a little too hard, but nothing changes, and you're having that cycle repeat itself and getting to a point where you don't even know if this cycle can be solved. That's still abuse. That's basically lying, and saying that you will change and there will be an improvement. And if there's not, that's also something you obviously have to look out for, where that might not be as obvious, and it's not an outright like, you're calling me out, I'm defensive. It's no, okay, yeah, I'm so sorry, I've been busy. I'll make this happen. But if nothing is changing, that's still something that you have to log, you know?
Yeah, and I like that idea of logging. It's like I'm not going to make a rash decision about a relationship just based on one single act, right? But I'm going to observe what's happening and I'm going to take note and I'm going to reserve that action for maybe a later time until I have more information. But each interaction informs our next interaction, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And maybe a quick thing before we go is, I would be cognizant and aware of, because a lot of our audience are former Mormons, or they were raised in high control religions and so forth. If you're still pretty fresh of going through such a big change like that, for example, with rehab and overcoming that, they say don't get into a serious relationship for at least a year. And I would second that. Whether you're still with your person, or you've left the church and you want to get out there dating, I would just really caution you to figure out who you are a lot more, and maybe uncover these things, because from my experience, when you do it and you're in a committed relationship, it can be really, really hard. And there's just there's certain things that you haven't been able to uncover yet. And that's why it's always good to take your time. So that's my little advice for maybe former Mormons, or people who have just decided, and they're heavily deconstructing, to be careful, because it's really exciting to find maybe like a non-Mormon or someone who has this different perspective, and it is intoxicating and exciting. But you owe it to them, and you owe it to yourself to take your time and learn to love yourself, and learn this new you.
Yes, for sure. I think that's such a good point, is that if you're deconstructing your entire worldview, you don't know who you are anymore right now.
No.
And if you don't know who you are, you can't really engage in a relationship in a healthy way, because you're just going to be sort of sliding around. So, Dr. Romani actually says if you're coming out of a narcissistic relationship, if you've been in an abusive narcissistic relationship, she says take a full year, no flirting, no texting, no dating, no nothing. Take a full year, meet yourself again,
Yeah.
and then re-engage. And I totally agree with that. I think when you're deconstructing religion, it can be, like you say, really tempting to like jump into a new relationship with somebody who is the opposite of who you would have chosen in your old life, right? But there again, if your worldview is majorly changing, then you don't know who you are yet, and it's so important to sort of have some foundational boundaries and some foundational values that you choose for yourself. But it's important to know what those are before you go out there in the world and start interacting with other people, especially attaching to other people when you have no idea how that's going to affect them or you.
Yeah, and with all this deconstruction you're doing, an example of leaving the church is, now you have this huge, we'll call it a void, that you now get to fill with learning to love yourself and learning who
Yeah.
you are. And there is no need for dating or any of that. Just learn about yourself. Fill this void, fill this new found space you have in your soul, and fill it with figuring out things you love, or figuring out things that you want to work on yourself. Like, there's all the time in the world for that. And that would be my advice, because I think I jumped in too quickly, and it, it wasn't a good thing. And I wish I hadn't. I wish I had taken more time.
Yeah. Well, that is great advice. Thank you so much for unpacking this with me. I think this is going to be really helpful to a lot of people. I think a lot of people are scared of the dating scene because they're scared of encountering a narcissist and maybe not knowing what to do. So hopefully this gives people a little bit of a framework of little things to start looking out for. Nobody needs to do anything drastic right now, just
No.
small little things to look out for, little changes, and little tiny tiny movements, not drastic actions.
Yeah, this is an exciting time where a lot of shifts are happening. And so enjoy the shift with yourself and discovering that, and friends, and growth, and then you trust in the universe. If you're doing what you should, everything you'll get who you need, you'll get what your heart desires, and there's no rush. And I think after the deconstruction part and all of this awakening is really, really fun, to be able to just focus in on yourselves and do things like this and find new hobbies and discover things you never would have before, because you have an entire new world to go explore.
Yeah, it's exciting. Remind us one more time what your Instagram and TikTok handle is.
Awakening Expansion. So
Okay.
awakening_expansion. YouTube is Awakening Expansion, and Instagram is as well.
All right. Well, I'm really excited to see more of what you're going to do online. And thanks, as always, for being so generous with your time.
Of course, Megan. Always a pleasure. And we'll chat soon.
All right. Take care.